He was absolutely essential. And also as crazy as a rat in a drain pipe, which is necessary. Somebody had to be really, really, really crazy, and it's better than your lead designer isn't. That was said by Ken Rolston, the lead designer of Morrowind. With the moons being parts of a deceased deity, stars being actual holes in reality itself, and, well, cat people, the one credit that can be given to Bethesda and its writers is that the world of Elder Scrolls is unique, for the lack of a better word. When writing a fantasy setting, there is a desire to go the safe, familiar route, but not Bethesda. The events and characters of games like Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim tend to be on the weirder and wackier side of things, where the world can feel like it was written akin to a homebrew Dungeons and Dragons setting by a dungeon master who has not felt the shackles of creative limitations in the millennia. And that credit can be partially given out to today's subject, Michael Kirkbride. This video intends to go in-depth over his history as a writer, highlight his most famous concept works and contributions to the world of the Elder Scrolls, and go over his more controversial and problematic side, and dive deep into whether his creative genius is to be cherished and encouraged or judged. But before we start, I want to point out that this video will contain a lot of sensitive themes, topics, and mentions, so I will provide some content warnings for the following themes on screen right now and before they occur. With YouTube's policies and censoring, I will also obstruct most sensitive words and topics. Now with that out of the way, let's introduce the subject himself. Michael Kirkbride, also known by initials MK, is a video game designer, writer, and artist who worked on Redguard, Morrowind, and Oblivion, as well as having smaller, uncredited roles on Daggerfall, Skyrim, and The Elder Scrolls Online. Kirkbride attended the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where he studied creative writing, painting, and comparative religion, before doing video game work with friends from college, stating that he lucked into games. He initially worked a bit on Tess' earlier titles like Redguard and Daggerfall, but very soon bonded with Kurt Coleman, Bethesda's quest designer at the time. It's been reported that Kurt and Michael bonded over their shared interest in weird fiction, especially Star Wars. MK's love for weird fiction did not go unnoticed. During the brainstorming of the world behind Morrowind and Vanderfell, the studio's room was plastered floor to ceiling with Kirkbride's sketches. As Michael himself says in this Polygon interview, the concept art came very early. We came up with a war room and I just filled it with drawings, and we would just get all excited about something over a ham sandwich and I'd have to draw it. We were just a bunch of kids making shit up, and Ken was our wise uncle trying to corral us in and make the crazy shit into a story that could be told. Essentially, everything that was kind of distinctive, the bugs, the ash, and the giant mushrooms, they basically all come from what I was scared of when I was a kid. And it was all about extremes in the earliest drawings. It went from Dark Crystal and Star Wars to Dune. There is a lot of Dune influence, that kind of Baroque society. And he didn't stop at simple sketches and design ideas. Michael wrote over 50 in-game books, most notable of them being the 36 Lessons of Vivec, which he says he simply couldn't stop writing, and managed to establish a good chunk of the deities and the mythology of the Elder Scrolls. As Ken Rolston said, the look of the game came from Michael Kirkbride, and I would say that it's not just the visual aesthetic. All of the narrative aesthetic of Morrowind also comes from Michael. I might have been the narrative lead, but Michael was the luminary, the man with the spectacularly exotic and bad judgment that excited us so much. And he is a rare talent in that he is a very good illustrator, not just in terms of making it readable, but making it mythically vibrant. He did the original map of Morrowind, which was the foundation of the different terrains and geographical experiences. Looking over Kirkbride's sketches that were shown throughout the video, it is clear that a lot of inspiration went into these designs. There is a resemblance to franchises like Star Wars and Dune, of course, but his inspirations don't necessarily end here. It's clear that the designs of the outfits, houses, and religion were also broadly inspired by Middle Eastern and Asian cultures. The unforgiving volcanic environment of Vanderfell has a noticeable impact on the clothing designs. Many outfits feature practical and protective elements, such as scarves or hoods to shield against ash storms, or layered clothing to provide insulation in different regions. Now, I wish to provide some context for the next chapter by throwing out a couple of characters so that people who don't know anything about Morrowind might have some idea of what's going on. Michael facilitated in writing the Morrowind's Tribunal, which is a trio of man-made gods, each of them with their own goals and beliefs. First is Almalexia, the brave and compassionate queen. Second is Sotha Sil, the powerful wizard behind the Clockwork City, and the third one is Vivec, the warrior poet, who will be discussed more in depth later on. Then there was also Nerevar, a champion and a general of the Dark Elven people, and Nerevarine, the reincarnation of the hero, who is also the player's character. With that context, we can come to an understanding that the three of the gods shared some similarities and were heavily inspired by Hinduism. MK confirmed that
Ardhanarishvara,
the androgynous aspect of Shiva, influenced Vivec. Vivec also writes about how cosmic time is repeated, even though it was not yet called Kalpa in Test 3. There are also mythological bits like Molag Bal rose up and extended 6 arms to show his worth, and the very name of Vivec was taken from Sanskrit language. The trinity of Sothasil, Vivec, and Almalexia are reminiscent of the Hindu trimurti of Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. Vivec is described as androgynous or gender fluid, which is not an uncommon characteristic of Hindu deities like Shiva or Vishnu. Shiva has a split down the middle half-male, half-female form, and Vishnu has a female incarnation which he uses to beguile and enchant. The whole ideology of mortal life being a test is also reminiscent of karma as a system, even if it lacks the direct concept of rebirth. There's also a cyclical time structure involving the creation and the destruction of the world over and over again. This led to some accusations of MK occurring spiritual emphasis on intersex beings specifically, although occurring emphasis on intersex beings is not an uncommon practice in religious myths, especially Hinduism. There is also a question to be made whether this sort of design was under cultural inspiration or cultural appropriation, and whether it has been done in poor taste as possible racist caricatures. One of more notable examples of this critique is MK's orc designs, depicting orcs as a caricature of Asian men. I can understand where one would get the idea from, specifically a caricature of Mongolian men, and this is criticizable as being a racist depiction. But I leave it up to the viewer to decide whether or not this was intended as a racist caricature. One of the most shared around images of Michael Kirkbride are with him on the floor with the caption, "Michael Kirkbride famously wrote the 36 lessons of Vivec by imbuing psilocybin mushrooms and LSD and locking himself in his apartment for a week." The above photograph was taken by Todd Howard upon discovering Kirkbride after he failed to show up to work for 5 days. It was one of the endless discussions for Morrowind and Elder Scrolls fans. Did MK really write all of Morrowind books and sketches while high or under influence? Is the lore and world of Morrowind so good because the mind behind it was broadened by mushrooms, LSD, psychedelics, and whatever else? Is that why no other game came close to Morrowind's insane world building? Is the creative genius of Kirkbride dead in the following projects because he's no longer under heavy usage of narcotics? Fortunately, almost all of that is false. This image was not taken by Todd. Kirkbride did not take mushrooms and LSD while working on the lore of Morrowind. He did, however, suffer from substance abuse, and it has close to no ties to writing Morrowind, much less than something like his actual religious studies. As MK himself states from this Reddit thread, "For over 10 years I abused liquor and benzos, a combination that tends to kill you. It started as a way to deal with anxiety and depression until it just became my life. I finally got to the rock bottom point where I didn't want to die, so I went to detox. I went into a facility to get better, to conquer insobriety, and when my insurance ran out, they said I was good to go. That's another thing they don't tell you, your journey to healing is only on their premises for as long as your deductible allows. My wife brought me back. She found me doctors that could help, cleaned up after me, put up with my mean-spirited tirades and unearthly new manias, reminded me our dog always knew who I was because he could smell through all of my unwanted disguises. I heard a lot of friendships, a lot of people I didn't know, and a lot of co-workers during this time. I wrote things I don't understand, don't condone, and half the time don't remember. I was awful when I was supposed to be getting better. If you got to know me from anywhere between 2013 and 2015, I'm really sorry. I thought I had no way back to sanity. And in the 10 years before, I wasn't much better. I do appreciate him sharing this story so openly, and I hope that it inspires and motivates right people in the way that they need. This year should be his 10th year anniversary of sobriety, so I hope that it's enough time for him to improve and become a better person than he was 10 to 20 years ago. Now, let's talk about Vivec. Vivec craves radical freedom, the death of all limits and restrictions. He wishes to be all things at all times, every race, every gender, every hero, both divine and finite, but in the end, he can only be Vivec. Said by Sotha Sil. There is a lot going on with Vivec, and if we were to go in depth, they would need their own separate video, so I will try to keep it brief. There are multiple theories of how exactly Vivec and the tribunal ascended. One claims that after Kagranak's tools were given to Sotha Sil for study and safekeeping, Sotha Sil was able to divine their mysteries and learn how to use them to tap into the heart of Lorcan, god of creation. Sotha Sil approached Vivec and Almalexia with a vision for a better world of justice and prosperity, heralded by the tribunal as the immortal guides and patrons. The tribunal then made pilgrimage to the Heart Chamber at the Red Mountain and used the tools to transform themselves into gods that now are known as Almsivi. Another theory hints that Vivec achieved godhood by understanding Kim, a self-realization that they're stuck in a dream of a god, or godhead. Vivec saw the godhead, but retained their individuality by knowing love. They loved themselves so much that their ego stopped them from evaporating. Also, since she loved herself, she also loved everything, since she knew that everything was an extension of the godhead, and therefore herself. And that description fits into Vivec's idea of gender ideology. Vivec wasn't simply intersex or gender fluid or something that fits into humans' perception of gender. Vivec wanted to be everything, all genders, all pronouns, all of everything, as everything is loved. And with her ego, she wanted to be loved and proven right by everything and everyone. Vivec learned Kim from Molag Bal, the Lord of Domination, after surrendering his headless body to him for 88 days, which could be literal or metaphorical, only to return and bite off their most important part to turn it into a spear, the one he later called Muatra, and producing thousands of offsprings. Another theory states that the tribunal were anticipated by the three good Daedra, or the three good gods, before their existence. Vivec was anticipated by Mathala, who much like she was manifold and androgynous. It is stated that through superhuman questing, virtue, discipline, and battling with evil, the tribunal were granted immortality and divinity from these good Daedras. This amount of theories proves Morrowind's idea of unreliable narration, as history doesn't come from a single, reliable source. But what we do know is that achieving godhood did not transform Vivec into a good person, no matter what their followers, dogmas, or sermons say. Vivec was a tyrant, secretive, oppressive, and a cowardly dictator. To list off the most notable events, first, it's heavily implied that Vivec was behind the murder of Nerevar, which spiraled into the whole Dark Elven race being cursed by their god and basically everything wrong that ever happened. She murdered Nerevar, but also wrote the lessons as a guide to godhood for the reincarnation of Nerevar and the player's character in Morrowind. Nerevar is probably the person she loved the most, other than herself. Second, the people of the Vivec city in Vanderfell could not have had a lot of choice whether to worship Vivec or not, as they were in constant pressure and fear of being under a giant meteor that is suspended in time and space and is controlled entirely by Vivec's whim. Vivec preaches that love is under his will only, and then forces love from his subjects via hanging Bar Dao in the sky. Third, Vivec basically created Dagoth, the game's main antagonist. They betrayed and murdered Nerevar, and then tried murdering Dagoth as well. They drove Dagoth into insanity and turned Nerevar's most loyal servant into a monster, tortured by the heart which he originally wanted to destroy, and it was Vivec who stopped him, and for thousands of years, before eventually being murdered by the hand of his beloved master's incarnation. Dagoth was a victim of circumstances. He tried to serve Nerevar and Azura faithfully, but Vivec was partly responsible for forcing him into these circumstances, forcing him into being the villain. Therefore, Vivec and the other two tribunal members can be considered the real villains of Morrowind. Vivec lies, but admits he does it openly. He claims to be generous and altruistic, devoting much of her powers to the defense of the Dark Elves and the state, while heading an authoritarian theocracy that has a meteor hanging over people's heads like a clenched fist. They are anything but a one-dimensional character. And it's important to dive deep into Vivec's character, as Michael was heavily involved in their creation, especially with the 36 sermons in mind. And it's a worthy mention that the idea of deities being outside of our gender ideology is not only in real-world religion like Hinduism, but was also shown in other video games too. A very famous example from one of the later titles would be one of Marika and Radagon from Elden Ring series, where it's eventually revealed that they are of the same person. Their identity or union or a strange symbiosis is still talked about among Elden Ring lore fans, but I personally interpret it as a message that the literal gods of the universe of Elden Ring have a completely different understanding of gender, going above and beyond the simple definitions of man and woman, as Marika and Radagon were clearly inspired by the Red King and the White Queen, also known as Rebus. Now, let's talk about the Forum. With everything established, we can now discuss one of the main criticisms that Michael's work received, which was the implementation of some very specific and sensitive themes into the matter of events and characters. One of these cases were old roleplays between Bethesda employees on their forums in early 2000s, which were written in order to explore their characters, and Michael would roleplay as the character of Vivec, and through text roleplay proceed with an implied, non-consensual intercourse with the character of Azura, who is the goddess of Dark Elves, calling her he, she, and so on. In literal terms, he stabs Azura with an actual weapon, the spear Muatra, but there is sexual aggression from Vivec, and there are clear sexual connotations that he wishes to make. His spear Muatra has overt sexual symbolism in Sermon 14, and does again when he attacks Azura in the roleplay. The main point that is usually brought regarding Vivec and her actions is symbolism. A lot of tales of Vivec, the roleplay was Azura, the multiple day intercourse with Moloch Baal, all of it can be interpreted as symbolic, which would not be too far from actual religious and theological myths. Sexual and non-consensual themes are unfortunately very common in mythological stories and religious tales, and are almost always metaphorical or symbolical, which doesn't necessarily outright excuse it, but it shouldn't paint the author behind it as a clear supporter. Regarding this, Michael says the following in the Reddit's Ask Me Anything. Vivec is a racist and a victim of rape, but implying, hell, even outright saying, that I endorse rape or perpetuate rape culture is both extremely stupid and offensive. However, in another thread, MK claims that Azura got what she deserved at the trials of Vivec, which is how the roleplay was called. A lot of what was shown can be defended with the author is not the character, and all of it is symbolic and metaphorical, and while those statements are not false, and I don't believe Michael is or ever was an endorser of such behavior, I would like to state a rule of thumb for writing: if you can include anything other than physical abuse or assault, don't include physical abuse or assault. That's my stance on that. If you want to show the audience that this character is evil or manipulative or the worst person on earth, there are better tools and tropes and qualities for that would convey the message all the same. While I understand that the character of Vivec was written more than 20 years ago, that doesn't fully excuse it, and the best we can do is hope that in 20 years Michael has improved as a writer in that regard. And in order to see his progress, let's see what projects he worked on next. During Morrowind's development from 1996 to 2002, Michael relocated to California and left Maryland-based Bethesda Softworks in April 2000 and shifted to ZeniMax's eNexus Studios, also known as Bethesda West. MK did leave Bethesda's regular employment at that time, but he has continued to work for Bethesda on a contractual basis, as and when required, i.e. whenever they make an Elder Scrolls game. This is the manner in which he has continued to work extensively on the Elder Scrolls with Bethesda in the years after he stopped permanent employment with the company. This is the following list of his contributions at the later time. MK wrote key dialogue, including all of Monkar Camoran's and plot elements. He wrote many in-game books for Oblivion, including Monkar Camoran's commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes, which serve as the central plot device in the game's main quest. The Knights of the Nine DLC was penned by MK, along with some in-game texts included. And MK is the creator of Pelennor with Kurt Coleman and the author of Pelennar's Song. Kirkbride reflected that writing for Oblivion without the same creative control he had on previous titles was difficult, and he did not play the game for 9 years after its release. However, the Song of Pelennor book and the overall story of Pelennor Whitestrake I personally consider to be some of the most interesting and unique pieces of Elder Scrolls lore that there is to date. I highly recommend listening or reading to the story of Pelennor, a time-traveling gay cyber crusader, and his adventures throughout Cyrodiil. For a really long time, I was uncertain whether it's ethical to indulge and support Pellennor's story and motives, as his story heavily implies him a role of enabling genocide against the entire elven race. But upon reading up on High Elves, the Eldmere Dominion, and especially Aelids, it's fortunately safe to say that it seems like they deserved what they got from Pelennor, maybe more, with them being elven supremacists and slave owners. Pellennor's tale is a legend of epic battles, high stakes, powerful allies, and iconic villains, and the Knights of the Nine DLC tends to reflect that. Even though in the DLC you interact only with his spirit, that is enough to portray Pellennor's strength, might, and belief in justice. MK also had some influence on Skyrim and ESO, but nothing exceptionally major outside of a few books. Now, let's talk about Coda. In 2014, Kirkbride released the script to Coda, a metafictional Elder Scrolls graphic novel/comic set in the 5th era, way in the future after the events of the games. The story of Coda was written as a conclusion to the overarching story of Morrowind and presented as a potential future of the Elder Scrolls universe. As Michael's wife, that goes by the nickname Lady Nerevar, says in this Reddit post, the theme of the comic is the death and the rebirth of the world, and its setting is a far future science fantasy master, which is one of the 2 moons. The word itself, coda, is a musical term for the ending passage of a composition. In this case, the composition is the current kalpa, which is a singular instance of the world, from creation till destruction. The controversy regarding Coda spiraled out of people's confusion whether this piece of work can be taken canonically, as it was written by one of Bethesda's contractual writers, and it's heavily involved within the TES universe, and goes completely out of bounds of what a typical TES game storyline is supposed to be, being filled with obscure and cryptic writing. So what exactly is Coda? An official piece of work written on behalf of Bethesda? A simple piece of fanfiction from a writer who no longer works there, made out of creative spite? Or is it a meta headcanon grown into 15 layers of self-awareness and irony? No. Coda is speculative fiction about an already fictional universe. Coda isn't meant to appear within the TES games. You're not going to see the plot of Coda in TES 6 or 7 or 8, and TES isn't going to jump in 1,000 years in the future into a post-apocalyptic science fantasy setting on the moon, because that would be against the respective mediums of both the game series and Coda. Alongside the story of Coda, the comic pushes the idea of Tamriel as a collective fiction, free to be interpreted, rewritten, and personalized by its reader. Let's expand on that thought. My interpretation of this work is that it's meant to deliver a message that the collaborative effort of all of the writers behind Bethesda and any other studio that contributed to the world of the Elder Scrolls, and any individual writers, including original work and fanfiction writers, all of it can be interpreted as canon solely based on the viewer's perspective. MK is trying to push us out of our usual bounds and limits, remove the duality of black and white aspect of what is considered to be canon, headcanon, fanfiction, etc. In simpler terms, the Elder Scrolls is whatever you want it to be. A blank canvas, with some events and characters thrown in to play around. A creative writing sandbox to be used, molded, and constructed to whichever shape you want it to be. One of the glaring examples of this approach is Queen Aerin, also known as the Unforeseen Queen, who is the Altmer leader of the Aldmeri Dominion and High Queen of the Somerset Isles during the Three Banners War. Queen Aerin was one of the more influential characters through some of the ESO's expansions and the base game, being the ruler of the Aldmeri Dominion, and while in some parts she is perceived as this intelligent and ambitious ruler who seeks to strengthen the Aldmeri Dominion and secure its dominance in Tamriel, another side describes her as a young, tyrannical, elven supremacist overlord that wishes to conquer Tamriel instead. And this is where Michael Kirkbride comes in, claiming that she's actually a sentient robotic intelligence from the 9th era called Kinmune that traveled back in time and was reconstructed into a body of a 28-year-old elf. People did not like this claim, and this Reddit comment states the following: making Aerin an evil robot from the future would ruin her character in the Dominion faction. Kinmune has been rejected by the devs and most of the community for a reason. The devs didn't like their character getting hijacked, or the face of one of the major factions being an evil robot. Most of the community liked Aerin as she is and considered Kinmune ridiculous. So the community's reaction to this claim was to suspect that MK tried to remake one of ESO's faction leaders into a robot from the future so that the High Elves can be seen as the ultimate evil once again. I don't know how to feel about this statement. One thing that I am personally certain in regarding this entire scenario is that it's confirmed and very clear that the developers of ESO and most of the players of ESO don't find it canon. However, Michael's message all this time is that if you, as a player or a reader or a member of the community, want it to be canon, then it is canon, which is ultimately harmless. If Michael wants his time-traveling robot OC from his own comic to be a faction leader in the Second Era Tamriel, let it be. It's his own perception of canon, and the man hasn't worked with Bethesda in a good decade, so I really don't see any harm in headcanoning your own original stuff to an already established fictional universe, as I believe that's what Coda was all about. But it's not about just the Elder Scrolls. After some eventful years at Bethesda with Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and ESO, it seemed clear that Michael wanted to bring matter into his own hands and work on something of his own mind and creation. Kirkbride wanted to taste creative freedom again, to operate his own projects and be able to implement his own rules and lore and stories. So let's jump into 2015, where he settled in a video game company after some yearly projects from game to game. He started working for this company in 2015 and went through 5 different projects by the end of the year 2018. Now you might ask, what kind of projects was this living legend working on after all the wackiness and confusion and controversies of the Elder Scrolls? What kind of insane and uncharacteristic worlds and stories can the man tell when mantling a role of a lead designer? The answer is Minecraft Story Mode. More specifically, Minecraft Story Mode, Game of Thrones the video game, 2 Batman video games, and the Walking Dead video game, more focused on the final season, first under Telltale, then under Skybound Games when Telltale crumbled into dust of bankruptcy. Now, Telltale Games are not exactly known for their exceptional writing, and the studio quite literally went bankrupt, so the inner machinations of the teams in Telltale are yet to be uncovered. However, after the final episode of The Walking Dead, the man was finally free, so he decided to dedicate the next 5 years of his life to his next project, which is... Have any of you heard of Immortals of Avium? Apparently it was published under EA and was worked on mostly by Telltale refugees who regrouped under the new name Ascendant Studios in 2018, and then worked on Immortals of Avium until August 2023. When it was released, the game received the most lukewarm reception possible. Even though the game took a unique approach to its own setting, it's a first-person shooter with heavy involvement of magic. It had a lot of ongoing issues. Poor performance due to Unreal Engine 5 requirements, incoherent characters, and reportedly, quote, Marvel-like writing, unquote. It's been reported that the game was trying to deliver a message, something about using the Earth's limited resources, but fell flat on its face. It didn't help that this 5-year-long project was released almost at the same time as Baldur's freaking Gate 3, which completely blew any other competitor out of the water for a damn good reason. But the combination of the issues and commitments and decisions led to the management of Ascendant Studios firing 45% of the game company's staff only 3 weeks after the game's release, allegedly due to poor sales of the game. Now I would like to move on to the chapter I call Public Perception. One of the most highlighted controversies surrounding Michael is his attitude towards fans. While on one hand he can be seen as very active around TES and ESO discourse, that doesn't mean that all of these interactions were positive. Unfortunately, I don't know the context for the following thread or what exactly the victim said to upset Michael, but apparently there was something negative about one of ESO's ex-writers, Lawrence Schick, on Facebook, to which Michael replied, "Keep bad-mouthing Schick and I'll shove a rusty coat hanger into your uterus, Isaac." It was later found that it was sent to a trans man, and I can agree that is pretty goddamn disgusting thing to say to anyone, and even more disgusting in context that he's threatening to assault someone and possibly trying to trigger their dysphoria over them criticizing Elder Scrolls Online. It is worthy of note that this comment came from 2014, which at this point would be 10 years old and also would have been during the peak of his unhealthy relapse from the addiction that was described earlier. However, that does not diminish the severity of his actions, especially if no progress or apology was made since. I don't think witch hunting the man for some incredibly immature acts of his on Facebook over 10 years ago will do any good for anyone, but I do think that we should go out of our way to inform the general public of his possible transphobia and overall rude behavior. In conclusion, we can ask, why is he universally praised? Does he deserve praise? Or does he deserve to be judged for his approach? And should he apologize? We come to a conclusion that one side of the internet perceives him as this mastermind behind the TES world, with his insane writings adding depth and mystery to the world, its events and stories, claiming that no other writer came close to how the world of Morrowind feels alive ever since, and yearn for that sweet year of 2002 where everything can be written without filters and restrictions. The other side claims that he is an ignorant person that threatens to assault people on Facebook, and his works are nonsensical, cringy, and cryptic for the sake of being cryptic, and his actual writing is subpar and barely legible, and projects like Immortals of Avium and Minecraft Story Mode are the only proof that he hasn't been relevant since 2003. Michael Kirkbride is a weird person. Every work of his fabricated tons of paragraphs of forum discussions, discourse, and arguments, and his stories, characters, and concepts left lasting impressions on people multiple decades after, although I do believe that his co-worker and colleague Kurt Coleman deserves as much, if not more praise, for general ideas and concepts behind Morrowind, as it was a group effort and MK is not behind everything TES 3 provided. Michael has implemented some curious ideas and concepts of stories behind man-made deities, stories of passion, commitment, and devotion, and made sure the world he was working on doesn't feel generic or boring, at least in the 2000s. But that doesn't alleviate him from the actions he has done throughout the years that caused damage to people he knew or didn't know, and some of his writing can be more harmful and hurtful than others in the state that it's currently in. But the great thing about writing is that it can be improved or rewritten or taken into less harmful contexts, as it's not cemented in the stone of time. It's hard to tell whether Michael improved in the department of fan interaction, but it seems that he settled down and poured all of his mind and effort into Warhammer 40k, so I hope he's better there. In conclusion, even with Bethesda's recent writing flop, I am not scared for the writing of Elder Scrolls 6, and I am not embarrassed of the writing of Elder Scrolls 5, even though both Michael and Kurt Coleman have already left the studio. I've realized that test games have something that will outlast a lot of AAA games, which is a sense of strong and self-sustaining community. Stories that are told through mods, artworks, fanfiction, and many other forms of media simply ooze love and passion, and I would never want to separate myself from that. This world needs weird people. People who think outside the box and create something so unique and so strange and cryptic that it makes it kind of ageless, perpetually confusing generations. But the best thing you can do to even out your contribution to the world is to simply not hurt others. Be weird, be strange, but also be kind.